And please join me in welcoming Mr. Ken Auletta, one of the most prolific writers in America today on media. Ken, thank you so much for joining us this evening. We've really been looking forward to talking to you, and we appreciate your time.
My pleasure, Bob.
You know, I thought we'd talk first about you for a minute, then we'd talk about people, then we'd talk about companies, and we would end talking about ideas, in particular the idea of journalism and its role in the new digital age in which we're living. Does that sound okay to you?
Whatever you like. I'm in your hands.
Fantastic. And also to our viewers, if any of you have questions about any of the topics that we're discussing, please feel free to send them in while we're talking, and I'll try and keep an eye on the iPad and add them to our discussion. So Ken, you grew up in Coney Island. You had many jobs in the newspaper and magazine business in New York, Village Voice, New York, The New Yorker. You wrote Annals of Communications for many years. How did you decide to get into journalism?
Well, I had a graduate degree in political science, and I thought I'd work in maybe as a diplomat or in government in some way, not running for office. And I wound up being campaign manager for a guy by the name of Howard Samuels, an upstate businessman who actually invented baggies and the plastic clothesline. And he was running as a Reform Democratic candidate. And with my help, he went from 20 points ahead for governor to 20 points behind. So I needed a job, and a low-paying job at that.
Dee, let's put up the list of Ken's books if we can. I know you've written over a dozen books, Ken. 5 of them have been bestsellers. Just so our audience can get a glimpse of some of the things you've been thinking about. The Underclass was a fabulous book. Greed and Glory on Wall Street, The Fall of the House of Lehman, a tremendous story. Three Blind Mice, my favorite book about the 3 networks and how they lost their way when cable came into the television universe. Microsoft, the whole thing with Bill Gates you did was fantastic. Ted Turner, one of my favorite heroes. Not to mention, most recently, Googled, The End of the World as We Know It, and Frenemies, The Epic Disruption of the Ad Business. Do you write for yourself or do you write for your audience?
You do both. I mean, basically, you want to please yourself and be able to say to yourself, I think this is good or this works. But for your audience, what you think about is, how am I going to lure them into reading this entire book? A book is 370, 400 pages, sometimes more. And so you have to write it in a way that tells a story that they want to read. And so you think about both. But you're not saying to yourself, my prime objective is pleasing the audience. You're saying your prime objective, I think, is pleasing yourself, that you've done a reasonable job, you've been accurate, and you've told what you think is a good story. But if they don't like it, then you failed.
Gotcha. Dee, let's put up that short list of some of the people that Ken's written about in his books. Ken, I just grabbed a handful. I mean, there were 65 names that I came up with of people that you've thought about, written about, since you've been focused on this subject. Let me just ask you, how do you get access to these people? You spend a lot of time with them in very intimate surroundings. How do you get away with that?
Well, first of all, it's like seduction. It takes a long period of time. You don't just say someone, will you marry me? You have to pursue them and romance them, if you will. And part of romancing them is to say to them, which I do all the time, and I mean it, I want to understand you. I'm doing this New Yorker profile, and I'm going to spend 3-4 months doing it. I can't succeed if I don't understand you. And in order to understand you, I need access to you. I need to watch you in action and be a fly on the wall, if you will. I need to do extensive interviews with you. And if you come off as someone like a dentist who, I just here to drill your teeth, they're not going to cooperate. And the fact that you're doing it for the New Yorker or a book helps gain you that access. And when you tell someone, I really want to understand what you work, don't forget, if you're Rupert Murdoch or Ted Turner or John Malone or Bill Gates, you've achieved the pinnacle of your business. You're at the top. And you feel that there's a part of you that says, I'd like people to understand exactly what I do. And if I feel I have a fair-minded Boswell to convey what I do, then their vanity kicks in. And that ultimately, without subpoena power, the power I have is their vanity to want to talk to me.
And you know, when you get close to them, Ken, you always end up in many of your books having what you've called the human factor. Can you give us an example of a story of, in your investigations, what you mean by that?
Sure. You know, years ago, I think it was 1994, I set out to do a profile of John Malone, who at the time was the most prominent and powerful person in the cable industry business. He ran Telecommunications Inc. He was called Darth Vader by Vice President Al Gore, perceived as an evil force. And he had never been profiled. And ultimately, he agreed to a profile. And I spent a couple of weeks in Denver with him, talking to his people, talking to him. And I was sitting in his office day after day. And at noon every day, there was no phones visible on his desk or in the credenza behind him. At noon every day, I heard a phone ring. And he opened up a drawer and he pulled out a red phone. And he said, "Yes, dear, I'll be right there." Then at 5 o'clock, the same thing happened. The phone rang. "Yes, dear, I'll be right there." This happened a couple of days, and I said, "All right, Malone, what's with that phone? Who are you talking to?" He said, "It's my wife." And I said, at noon, what are you doing? He said, "I'm meeting her for lunch every day. And at 5 o'clock, I'm meeting her at the gym at 5 o'clock. So I said, "Mr. Malone," I said, "tell us why you sold your company to Bell Atlantic for $34 billion. And he said, "Well, obviously the money was good." And I said, "That was the assumption. It was such a huge price that people thought that was the reason." I said to him very innocently, because I didn't have another theory in mind, I said, "Was there any other reason you sold your company?" And he couldn't help himself. He was just candid. And he said, "Yes." I said, "What was it?" He said, "My wife said she would leave me if I didn't sell the company." I said, "What? Why?" And he said, "She told me that you promised me when we married, we'd be together. And we're never together. You're always working. You're always traveling. And it's not acceptable." And he said, "I love my wife and I didn't want to lose it." That's the human factor. So here we are, the headlines of daily people who from a distance are writing about this guy, John Malone, Darth Vader. And when you got close to him, you found something really surprising. And I find that all the time when I spend time. I'm not saying the human factor is the dominant factor in people's decision making, but oftentimes it is a huge factor. When I covered the Microsoft trial and Bill Gates gave 20 hours of depositions in that trial, cross-examined by David Boies, a very good litigator. And Bill Gates was offended by the questions. And he had on a mustard green suit, and he was drinking Diet Cokes. And he was just really surly and angry with the questions. Judge Jackson, who was the federal judge who ruled on the Microsoft case alone, there was no jury. When I spent time with Judge Jackson, I said, "Judge Jackson, how'd you come to the decision that Microsoft was guilty?" He said, "I thought Bill Gates was a liar." I said, "Why do you think that?" He said, "Well, my dad, I went to work, my first job in government was to work for Richard Nixon. And I was an idealistic young Republican, and I was very proud to work for Nixon's reelection in 1972. And then I discovered that Nixon lied to the country and to me, and it really upset me." Well, when he was looking at Bill Gates, he was seeing Richard Nixon. So his biography the 12 hours I spent with the judge, learning about him and how he grew up and how he felt, made me better understand how he reached a decision at Microsoft. Now you can question whether the human factor should have spilled over in that case, but it did.
Well, you know, I'd love to hear the human factor on another mogul, that being Rupert Murdoch. If we could talk about him for a minute, Ken. And Dee, let's put up the News Corp slide if we can briefly. Yeah, just for our viewers, you know, I was amazed at the size of this company. 28,000 employees, 150 different entities, 50 newspapers, 30 magazines, 13 TV studios, 10 satellites. And you know, this picture on the left, Ken, of Rupert and his two sons must have been in better days. How are the three of them getting along now? And you've spent time with him. You had dinner in his home, right? What
Many
kind of guy
times.
is he?
When
I
I
mean,
was
what's it like being around Rupert Murdoch and his
Well,
family?
Murdoch is actually, I spent about 5 months doing a profile of him in 1995. And I spent 10 days as a fly on the wall in his office. We had dinner maybe 6 or 7 of those nights. We flew together to a summit meeting he wanted to have with John Malone, which I attended and wrote about. It was all on the record. And he had Murdoch, like Malone, is uninhibited. He's not afraid to tell you whatever he thinks. So when you ask him a question, he's not like an employee. He just says whatever he wants to say and whatever he believes. He's very charming, one-on-one. He's very smart. He's very interesting. Very different than John Malone. Malone is a scientist. He's an engineer. He's someone who thinks deductively. And Murdoch is someone who thinks instinctually. And so he makes decisions just instinctually to do things. And when I was with him, he was every morning brought to his office was a plate of apples, sliced apples. He would eat them. In the afternoon, a plate of sliced carrots would come to him. And after about 3 days of watching this, like I did with Malone, I looked at the carrots. I said, "What are you, a rabbit?" Again, being jocular doesn't hurt in these relationships. And he said, "No, Anna, my then wife, wanted him to be healthy." And at night, when we went to his house, the two of us had dinner. I'm interviewing with my tape recorder going. He pours a glass of Montrachet. He drinks white wine, a glass of Montrachet for himself. This is a Cadillac of wines. And then I go to pour him a second glass. He says, "No, I can't have it." He said, "Anna doesn't want me to have more than 2 glasses." And the thought that he just months later or a year or so later would get divorced from Anna just stunned me, because I thought he was so reliant on her and in love with her. But sometimes, as close as you can't get inside a marriage.
Did you find out when you were with him, Ken, did he invent the Fox News conservative positioning for a news program, or was that Roger Ailes?
Well, it was his idea to have a conservative television cable network. And that's why he set out to hire Roger Ailes. I mean, but Roger Ailes was a brilliant producer who executed it. Now, I mean, he came up with the slogan, "fair and balanced," which it's not, but nevertheless, that was his proposal. But he worked for Rupert Murdoch. In the end, he was fired by Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch is not someone who is dictated to by others. He's the boss.
What's his relationship with Trump?
Well, he always had disdain for Trump, which is really interesting. And in fact, if you go back to 2016, in the early days, he didn't much like him. But ultimately, when Trump began to pick up steam, he endorsed him and embraced him and became very much a partisan for Donald Trump. But privately, he has often said to people, expressed a certain amount of disdain for Trump, for his blabbing too much, tweeting too much.
Yeah. You know, I could talk to you about Fox all night, but we have such a short time here. I'm gonna keep us going here, and I want to go to another favorite company of mine. Dee, if we could put up the photo of these two young founders, Larry Page and Sergey Brin. I love this photo. These guys look so innocent. And you know what I mean? The company that they have built is so amazing. You spent years there, right, Ken, at Google? What was it like? You talk about visiting different planets, and you've gone on a different planet. What was the planet of Google like when you were there?
The planet of Google, the reason I use the phrase visiting other planets is that essentially you go and you say on a quest for discovery. And so I set out to understand who are these people who created this planet Google, and what's the value system, what makes it different. And This is a company that was started in 1998, and that picture you show is around that time. And if you think about it, Google at that time, don't be evil, we're going to make the world safer for democracy. That was all part of what they believed. And they had no advertising. They had no revenue stream, no advertising. They didn't have advertising until 6 years later, 2004. They thought, they were worried about having advertising. They were worried that the advertisers would have too much sway over the search engine. But and if you go to, when you went to the campus and you spent time interviewing the people, and they very generously allowed me free reign to wander about the campus, and I went there most days and did that. And the first thing you thought about was the free food and how good it was. I mean, really wonderful food. But when you interviewed the engineers, and many of the employees were engineers, you realized that they, like Page and Brin, they started from a different set of assumptions than most of us are used to. They started from the assumption, we're here to disrupt the way things are currently done, and A, and B, we don't ask permission, we just do it. And if you talk to the engineers, what they were seeking to do was to disrupt the traditional world. So for instance, one day I was asking how you do digital books, and they very proudly took me into their sanctum to show me how they do it. And they thought they had impressed me by showing one of my books that they had digitalized. And they went and they showed me, you can get this book for free. You can search through Ken Auletta's book. You can see anything you want in that book. And I'm sitting there trying not to show any emotion at all. But as soon as I finished with that interview, I called my publisher and I said, do you know that Google is stealing my book? They have this concept that anything that's published is fair use, and therefore they can freely take it and disseminate it. And if you're a writer and that's how you make your living, you're worried about your copyright and protecting it. And they were not. In the end, they were compelled to, I was there in 2006, 7, 8. And in the end, they were compelled to make a deal with publishers and pay them to promote their books or show parts of the books, as I think is fair. So they came to reluctantly realize that there's such a thing as copyright that they had to respect.
Google and Facebook, I think, can share about 70% of the digital advertising market, which is the largest advertising market in the world today. And then I just noticed a chart the other day. Dee, do you have the Amazon chart we could throw up for our viewers? I can't believe that Amazon ad revenue is now outpacing Facebook's revenue. Could Amazon be a competitor to Google, do you think? I mean, I now used to always go on Google. Now if I want to buy something, I don't go on Google, I go on Amazon.
Amazon is a competitor to Google. I mean, if you think, but just in terms of cloud computing, they eclipse Google. They're much bigger than that. But if you think about search, you mentioned you do searches on Amazon. Half of the searches today on Amazon are not done through Google, they're done through Amazon. And if you look at, you mentioned the growth of advertising, they are growing faster in terms of advertising revenue. They're still behind Google and Facebook. But nevertheless, if you're sitting in the Google chair or you're sitting in the Facebook chair, you're worried about Amazon. And the reason you're worried about them from an advertising point of view, if you're an ad agency or an advertiser, you're Nike, you want to know what your consumer purchases, not just what they might watch, whether they watch your ad. They want to know what you actually purchase. The only one who has that information is Amazon. Google doesn't have it. Facebook doesn't have it. So for an advertiser, Amazon is a very attractive buy. And Google knows that, Facebook knows that, and they worry about that. And by the way, one of the reasons you hear Apple complaining about privacy and there's too much information that the Googles and the Facebooks and the Amazons have about you is because Apple is not in the advertising business. So they can play the virtuous role, but it's a very convenient one.
Right. I was thinking about these three companies, Google, Amazon, and Facebook, and trying to put it in context in my own mind, Ken. Dee, let's put up that top 10 top 10 company slide if we can. This is the top 10 U.S. companies by market cap. I hope it's accurate. It's always changes. Microsoft at the top, Apple. Now Amazon is in the $1 trillion club, I think. It goes back and forth. Tesla's not in there, although it should be. I think it's $600 billion. But you know, what stunned me was the top 5 companies are all digital, 4 billion. And the second 5 companies in the top 10 are the traditional companies that we've all invested in. And they're only $1 billion, $1.4 billion. So the top 5 are 4 times the size of the second 5. You know, I wonder, 10 years from now, Ken, do you think all top 10 companies are going to be digitally centric organizations?
Probably, except that, you know, one of the things, Walmart, for instance, is a company that has tried aggressively to get into the online business to compete with Amazon. They've done a reasonable job at that. So if you go out 10 years, if in fact Walmart is successful in creating real competition to Amazon, they'll still be on that list. But you know, if you go back to the fall of 2017, the world was stunned when Rupert Murdoch sold much of his company to Disney. Right. And what he sold? He sold the studio, he sold the television production arm, some of the cable option. And why did he do that? And this goes to the heart of your point about the growth of digital companies. He looked at Netflix and he said, I'm spending on Fox television to produce television every year, $2 billion. Netflix is spending $15 billion. Netflix has a cap, a market cap. They can, so much greater than mine, they can buy anything. I can't. The only way that they can be competed against is someone like Disney. And that's why he sold for $70-some-odd billion his company to Disney. He realized he could not compete with the Netflix of this world. The digital giants were just growing and growing, leaving companies, even the great Rupert Murdoch, in terms of his power, way behind.
But you know, as we move into this digital era, Ken, and you saw it coming. I mean, I think Barry Diller credits you with the information superhighway was something that you coined back in the beginning. All these issues, social issues, arise. For example, is it fair that Jack Dorsey decides who's on Twitter, who's not on Twitter?
Is it fair that he what?
That he's the decider with such a major communications?
This is the real issue. Or Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook, or the people that should corporations have that kind of power over the public that way? That's a basic question, and one that clearly, when I was doing the Google book and spending all that time, one of the things they were blind to was the power of government. They did no lobbying. They had no operation. They didn't make any campaign. They thought it was corrupt, as Bill Gates thought about before the Microsoft antitrust trial in 2000. They thought it was corrupt to be lobbying the government and asking for favors. Well, they've changed dramatically because they now realize that, in fact, government is the 800-pound gorilla that can kill them. And what's happening today is one of the few areas where there's a lot of bipartisan agreement, Republicans and Democrats, is that the digital giants, many of them have too much power. Not just power in terms of monopoly questions, but power over privacy and power over the content of what you read or don't read, and power over rumors and the ability to disseminate false information. And so if you're sitting in their chairs in Silicon Valley, you're really worried today. And you know that people may be coming after you.
I'm not sure I could think of anything worse than government getting in the middle of regulating the internet and deciding, you know, privacy protection I can understand. I think that surveillance capitalism of taking data from us for free and selling it to advertisers without our knowledge is such a huge business now, and I'm not sure how we got there, but it just seems to me something's wrong with that picture. But I do wonder for privacy and for regulation at this point, Ken, what the solution is in terms of having a society with an epistemological base that makes sense.
It is not clear there is a good solution. For instance, in covering the Microsoft antitrust trial, Judge Jackson ruled that Microsoft should be broken up. I thought that was a crazy ruling in 2000, because if you looked at what was happening with open source software and stuff, the internet was going to break up Microsoft on its own. The government didn't have to try and engineer that. So when you say, well, break up Facebook or break up Google, split off some of their part, WhatsApp, take WhatsApp away from Facebook, that's a dangerous, obviously a dangerous thing, government to engineer that. Does government know what it's doing? And maybe a better solution would have been, don't allow the Facebooks or the Googles to buy potential competitors, which is exactly why Facebook bought WhatsApp. Yeah. So it's all complicated. The other really even more complicated issue, Section 230 of the Communications Act says it exempts digital companies like Google and Facebook from policing the content on their site. Say you can't act as an editor. And now people want to change that to impose upon them the same regulations that they impose on television. But imagine, Facebook has billions of users and billions of everyday people going on it, and Google the same. How would you police the content of that? How would you say, Google, we don't like this fake news item on your search, or Facebook, we don't like this fake news item. You should have stopped it. And Facebook, rightly, or Google rightly, could come back and say, how am I going to stop that? I'm doing the best I can. So it's really complicated. And when you get into the details of it, you want government, and I'm not confident government has that competence to really, look closely at that. I think we have to do a better job of forcing them to police some of the malpractices they follow. But to expect nirvana, that it's going to be perfect, is crazy.
Well, maybe there's a way to manage the worst of it. I just remember I was in the newspaper business and I was on the advertising side, but there was a lot of thought about getting to the heart of the story, getting the facts, getting it straight. And now, and I may be one of the few people in our audience that looks at Facebook and Instagram and TikTok and Tumblr and all the rest of them. But when I think of young people getting the bulk of their news from these things and reading stuff on these social networks that are obviously deliberate misinformation put there by bots, internet robots that have algorithms, that send them in massive amounts, I just don't know what the solution is. It's of concern to me. And I think from the standpoint of a society that's trying to work together as a group, whatever happened to facts that we could all agree on? I mean, whatever happened to, things that all made sense to all of us? If we all have different facts, is that going to work?
Well, it goes back to something former Senator Pat Moynihan said. He said, you're entitled to your own opinion. You're not entitled to your own facts. And one of the problems today is there are no universal facts. If you watch MSNBC, you get one set of facts. If you watch Fox, you get another set of facts. Or Newsmax, you get another set of facts. If you read the New York Times, you may get a different set of facts than you get from Gannett. And so the question becomes, what is universal? Is there any way to get back to accepting this is a universal fact? Donald Trump did not win the election. That's a fact, by the way. It's not even contestable. And yet you had people contesting it, saying, well, my God, he got 74 million votes. But Biden got 81 million votes. So, but it's nevertheless, it's really complicated. And people, partly because of Twitter and Facebook and the ability that it democratizes information, allows people a voice. And there's something really positive about that. But the negative is that everyone has a voice, and you tend to search for those who share the same voice you believe in. And therefore you ignore those or get angry at those who have a different voice. And that's a universal problem in America today, probably around the world. And what the solution is, boy, oh boy.
Well, I think it's very divisive, but I don't know what the answer to it is. And when I think of the ecosystem of print, Washington Post, New York Times, New York Post, television with MSNBC and CNN and Fox and the rest, and then all of these digital, Twitter and all the rest of, Parler and Gab and all the rest of it. I'm trying to think of who's on first these days, Ken. I mean, who follows whom? It seemed to me that Twitter was in the lead for many, many months, at least when former President Trump was in office. Everybody had to look at their phone every minute to see, what the newest thing was. Who do you think is actually going out and getting the news and trying to get to what we would call objective facts? Is it digital, is it print, or is it television?
No, I mean, I think the New York Times, I can fault some of the Times, some of the headlines, some of the stories, and whether they're too preoccupied, say, with Trump, or they were at one point. But I think the New York Times is still the world's best newspaper. I think the Wall Street Journal in its news pages is really a wonderful newspaper. And does really, really good works. I was worried when Murdoch took it over that he would try to do with the Journal what he did with the New York Post and some of the British tabloids. He hasn't done that, to his credit. He's put money in, the way Bezos has put money into the Washington Post. And all three are good newspapers because of that. When I watch, be it CNN or MSNBC, I'm pushing aside Fox, who I think is in a separate category. But I'm very troubled to watch anchors, which supposedly neutral referees, opining all the time. And I'm very troubled that CNN, which has always touted the fact that it has more correspondents around the world than any other television news source, with the possible exception of the BBC, you don't see them. What you see are people in the studio talking and opining. And that bothers me. Fox is actually beyond that, in my judgment. I think Fox doesn't cover things that they have an agenda, and it's a Republican agenda, and which troubles me. And that doesn't mean I don't do good things, but if you watch them at night in prime time, from 7 o'clock on, it is just a screed, and it does very well, and it's their best business at News Corp.
Yeah.
But it is not a respectable business.
Well, they all seem opinionated to me. I mean, I play golf with a guy today that wraps fish in the New York Times. He wouldn't read it if he had to. But, it just concerns me. And I guess, Ken, it's cheaper to have an opinion news network than it is a real news network where you have reporters and they're out in the field and stuff like that. And we've gotten to a point where these profit margins really dictate the way these businesses are run. And I just think as a democracy where people are voting on issues and people and policy, it would be great if we could get back to having somehow the same understanding of the facts of what we're talking about.
Bob, it's not just that it's cheaper, which it is, and that's an incentive for the television, cable news to do that. But it's also, that's what the audience wants. They know that their viewers want opinion, and they want to see fighting, and they want to see clashes. And so we bear some measure of blame for that, not just the Murdochs or Jeff Zuckers and the people who are on CNN and MSNBC.
Yeah. Now, I saw Zuckerberg on the cover of the New York Post a couple weeks ago with this legislation in Australia. So in talking about the curation of news and editorial integrity and all that, what is going on with the Australian legislature relative to Facebook and Google, Ken?
If you look at what's happened to newspapers and magazines, they have really fallen off a cliff in terms of revenue and readers. And they've fallen off that cliff in part because the public is getting information from the internet. And so what newspapers have said, led by Murdoch has been a pioneer in this. They've argued that you have to compensate and subsidize newspapers and magazines who you're taking your information for free from, and pay us something and to keep us in business. You should not be allowed to just steal our content. And the reason it's in Australia, that has a lot to do with Murdoch. That was his base initially, and he owns a lot of TV and television and newspapers in Australia. And so what the legislation says, and this is happening in the EU, and it's going to happen here, you're going to lean on the Facebooks and the Googles and say, you have to provide some support for newspapers or for print, which is really providing you with free information and news.
And now I see Google has I can't think of what the name of it is, but it's a new news product. They're going to spend $1 billion hiring newspaper editors. And when you Google something, you'll get a curated newspaper set of stories instead of just a straight Google algorithm. I don't know if that's going to work, but I guess they're attempting to put some kind of a editorial curation in the things that they put up, and maybe that's a good thing.
And they're trying to head off government doing what Australian government has done. And that's going to be an ongoing thing. So the Googles and the Facebook are going to try and give a little bit, and government is going to try and ask for a lot more. And there will be battles as there have been in Australia.
Okay. Ken, do you have any concerns about journalism long-term as a business, having spent your career? I know we've talked a lot about it in terms of the digital media, but moving forward in the next decade, are we on a solid footing in terms of being able to read stuff that makes sense, or do you think we're in this area that we've been talking about where you're not sure what you're reading, you're not sure who to believe, and you just have to, every man for himself?
I worry, I have a lot of worries about journalism in the future. Let me start with one that's really worth attending to, and that's the absence of local news. Local newspapers are dying all across America, not to mention the world, but in America. Let's just stay with America. And what does that mean? It means that who is going to monitor what the mayor, the city council, the governor is doing? And without resources, these local newspapers, even if they exist today, they don't have the resources to do investigative reporting. Investigative reporting takes time, days, weeks sometimes. They can't afford to allow their reporters to spend that kind of time on a story that ultimately may be important, but is not as well read as a story about Kim Kardashian. And so the problem of what happens to local news and its ability to monitor government and to tell readers what's going on in the real estate market in your community, in the restaurants in your community, in the theaters and the culture in your community, that is being diminished, and that's a huge issue. The second issue, which is even larger, is the one we talked about before, which is universal facts. How do you get to a point where people respect that this is not fake news, this is real news? And this spills over into political questions. You know, if the politics is polarized, then what is fake news or what is not is going to be polarized. And that's a huge issue. But the ability of newspapers and local television stations to continue is being challenged today. And there are consequences to that. I mean, if your local newspaper is one you've grown up with and you trust that. Well, suddenly something comes online and you're getting information or someone tweets. Can you trust that? Does it have the brand value that your local newspaper has? That's a really big question. And what if you act on that information and the information is false?
Here's one. Who would you most like to write about, but you can't, and why? Who would you most like to write about, but you can't, and why? Provocative question.
Well, you know, I'll tell you, I don't know that I would have, I think a story that begs to be, a profile that begs to be done is Lachlan Murdoch. And he's the son of Rupert, the eldest son of Rupert Murdoch. And Murdoch christened him to be his successor and he's the CEO of the company and the vice chairman of the newspaper part of the company. And we know very little about him. I've interviewed him in the past. And when he was the publisher of the New York Post, he had a falling out with his father through Roger Ailes. But he's a real powerhouse. And how does he feel about Fox News and Sean Hannity, et cetera? How does he feel about newspapers? His father has for years supported newspapers that lose money because he supports them because he loves newspapers. I once asked Rupert Murdoch, I said, in your entire empire, Mr. Murdoch, be it television or movies or advertising or digital investments you've made, cable investments you've made, what is the thing that you love most? And without hesitation, Murdoch said, the newspapers. I love being in the New York Post newsroom or the Sun newsroom and just helping craft headlines. And that, you know, does Lachlan have that? lust? A. B. What happens when Murdoch, who's going to turn 90 this week, what happens when he's off the stage? And will the family come together? I mean, James is Lachlan's younger brother, and they've had a falling out. For years they haven't gotten along, but Rupert Murdoch has basically pushed James aside. James left the board of the News Corp. He got his $2 billion from the sale to Disney, but he's outside the fold. Elizabeth, the daughter, who a very successful television producer in London, who was very estranged at one point from the family, and you could imagine she and James would be allied. And then Priscilla, who's the daughter from the first marriage, who's not involved in any of this. Where she stands, we don't know. But it is conceivable that the family could divide and that the votes would be with James. But then the question becomes, who decides succession? Is it the board of the company, or is it the trust, the family trust, that decides that? And we don't know the answer to that. But that's a rich story.
Here's a question.
You asked what I couldn't get it. That's the one.
That's the one.
There's no way they would talk.
Yeah. Here's one. My family and I only watch Netflix and Amazon, and now there are so many more streaming networks, we're not even sure which ones to watch. How in the world are the television networks going to survive?
I think they have a very hard time. I mean, what happened with Oprah Winfrey the other night, 17 million viewers Sunday night on CBS, is a rarity. That was twice the size of a normal audience. So when I did my television book, and you went back in the 80s, for instance, or 9 out of 10 people who were watching television were watching it on the networks that night in prime time. Today, you're down to a third, maybe, and that's a dwindling number. It keeps going down. So people are streaming, and they're watching what they want, when they want, as much as they want, and on Netflix and HBO and the other streaming without commercial interruption. One of the things that this is a real threat to the advertising business, and I wrote about this in my last book, Frenemies, that people hate the interruption. You watch an hour show, and you basically a third of that time is eaten up by commercials. And when people who write stories for network television or for cable television have to write them in a way that they're ups and downs, planning on the commercial breaks. And that changes storytelling. And you watch Netflix, you don't have that. HBO, you don't have that. The problem that the streamers have is there's so much content, so many shows, so many movies. How do you find out about it? It used to be you had TV Guide, but you don't have that you can't have that for thousands of choices. And how do you find out about something? It's the marketing problem for the streamers. It's a huge problem, a bigger problem than television has. Television can promote upcoming things, but it's a dwindling audience, and they're going to lose. For instance, look at football. One of the biggest attraction is moving away from networks. Mm-hmm. Amazon just made a huge bid for the NFL rights. And I think as you go forward in the future, we'll probably see football, the most popular watch sport, flee network television.
Ken, thank you.